Hello and welcome to episode 306 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrodin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you this morning, Bill?
I'm doing great, Seth. How are you?
I'm recovering after a really, really nasty bout of COVID and strep throat on top of it. So,
Oh,
yeah,
no.
that was nice. It's fun. Yeah. Lots of fun. But this week, we'd like to welcome back our new guest, but he's a returning guest for this season. He is the curator's distinguished professor of U.S. military history at Missouri University of Science and Technology, author of 15 books, and I'm sure many more in the future. His trilogy about the United States Army operations in the Pacific during World War II have become go-to references on the subject, and we are always excited to have him back here with us. Please join us in welcoming back John McManus. John, how are you this morning?
Doing great. Great to be with you guys. I'm glad you're feeling better, Seth. That's really a bummer to have
Yeah, it
COVID.
sucked.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's the
Terrible.
second. It's the second time having the itis, but we'll be all right. We'll be good. Good thing we're doing this remotely, right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
right. Then it's safe.
Indeed. Well, before we get started, we want to ask you to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel as it helps other people find our show. We want to get the history to the masses, and if you want to help us do that, please like and subscribe to the show and click the like button on the episodes. So we'll get on with the show this morning. The term military intelligence is more often than not an oxymoron. Sometimes so-called intel is accurate, and sometimes it is not. Sometimes it is valuable, other times it is not. When it is accurate, military intelligence can tip the scales in a battle or campaign, often drastically. Deciphered messages and accurate analysis gave the U.S. Navy cryptanalysts at Station Hypo and Station Frumell the opportunity to provide Admiral Nimitz with accurate intelligence that directly led to the United States Navy's success at Midway. Accurate intel analysis led to the shootdown and killing of Japanese Admiral Yamamoto. Inaccurate intelligence analysis nearly led to a planning and operational disaster at Los Negros in February 1944. So it can go either way. And frankly, more often than not, it can be based on chance. A chance decrypt, a shrewd observation, or a random discovery, as was the case in January 1944. Part of the problem is that there were so many intercepted messages and lack of decryption capacity, it wasn't clear which one should be decrypted first. There was a certain randomness to this, and that sometimes failed us. For example, if you decrypted message A, which laid an enemy course of action, but then missed message B that changed the course of action, you would be absolutely led down the wrong path. Uh, a chance discovery by an infantryman in the Australian 9th Infantry Division directly led to a massive breakthrough for MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command and allowed him to plan and execute two invasions that likely saved thousands of American lives and sped up the timetable of the war for General Mack that was inexorably marching back towards his ultimate goal of recapturing his beloved Philippines. Now, when I say intel breakthrough, I am not lying here, am I, John? This was a huge discovery by these Aussies in the jungle, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue this is one of the greatest intel discoveries in modern military history. And it's just, like a lot of intel discoveries like this, there's some element of luck involved, but also malfeasance and incompetence and just plain old human foibles. What happens here is that you know, the Japanese are retreating westward along the New Guinea coast. The Allies have been kind of pressuring them throughout much of late 1943 and early 1944. And as they're retreating westward, of course, they can't take everything with them. And so they are destroying, much of their kit, just taking kind of what they can carry. And one of the things that they're destroying is their code books. So you would think, okay, well then I guess you burn them. Well, ordinarily you would, but the climate is such, it's so damp, it's so rainy, it's so soggy, so moldy that this becomes near to impossible. And so there's a Japanese signals officer whose name is lost to history, fortunately for him, who decides, I'm going to get rid of all this stuff by putting it in a kind of a steamer trunk into a steel trunk. And that's bad enough. Basically they sink it into a swamp, figuring the Allies will never find this or even know what it is. But the other thing that he does, he tears off the covers of the code book and he sends them in to higher command and attests to the destruction of the code books, and when in fact this has not been done. So it's the worst of both worlds that he's left that material out in such a place that it could possibly be recovered by the enemy, and he's made his superiors think that it's been destroyed, that there's no chance that the code books have been lost. So, like you said, Seth, troops from the Australian 9th Division find the trunk and, amazingly enough, look at it and figure out this is important, and then they get it farther on up the line where it can really do some good. So that's the other part of intelligence. It has to actually do some good farther up the line by people who know what to do with it.
Right. And the fact that it was actually even discovered at all is like one of those things where I said things are, a lot of times left to chance. This is one of those things. I mean, the fact that this cat actually found this in the hole, in the mud hole, and was able to get it out and then actually it have something worthwhile is just miraculous in and of itself. So to lay it out there, what we're talking about specifically here is the contents of this box carried most, not all, but a great majority of the Imperial Japanese Army's codes, right, John? I mean, these were something that Max people and the Navy had kind of not really been able to get into. They were reading JN-25, they're reading the Navy pretty much, when they wanted to, essentially. But the Army's codes were lacking. And this helped MacArthur significantly because of the fact that he was able to actually get, once they broke these codes, which didn't take long because they had the damn code books, to read their mail, to read accurate intelligence, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, in almost real time. I mean, what the biggest value of it is that you're able to figure out their order of battle and their troop dispositions, and that's what really makes a major difference. Well, now when it gets when these code books get pressed up the line, the other element of this is really quite remarkable and kind of innovative. Is that MacArthur's headquarters, of course, is recognizing them for what they are, but also now has the technology to recover them, because the books are not in good condition. They're muddy, they're wet, everything that the Japanese thought they might be. Well, they're using early microwave technology to bake these things, to dry them out without burning them up or whatever, and recovering them well enough that you can basically piece it together and read what happened. So I think it's emblematic of the fact that SWAPA, Southwest Pacific area, its intel section has become quite sophisticated by now. It has a lot of different components and elements to it, and I think this is one example. So as it gets farther on up the line, now once you get to the kind of staff level, you can begin to form a pretty good idea of where the Japanese strengths are on New Guinea and where they're not. And when you're thinking about future invasions, obviously that's really good information to have. So one of the things I say in my book is that whoever this Japanese officer was, he does much more damage to his cause than the famous Benedict Arnold ever did to the American cause 200 some odd years earlier. This guy absolutely consigns his comrades to a horrifying future on a lot of levels.
Hey, John.
Yeah, I mean, he go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I'm sorry. MacArthur must have been driven crazy by the fact that the naval codes had been broken, and to some extent we were able to read Navy messages, although we were overwhelmed and only ended up reading a fraction of naval messages. And now he's got a similar advantage. Was he able to read a higher portion or proportion of Army messages than the Navy guys were able to read naval messages?
I mean, I think actually, Bill, he's able to have better, more actionable kind of intelligence than the famous Navy, intel that leads to Coral Sea and Midway, because that takes a lot of extrapolating, a lot of sort of, gaming it and figuring out, maybe they mean Midway. Let's put this little bait out there or whatever. MacArthur doesn't have to do that because the Japanese have no idea that this has been lost, and this is the kind of material that's betraying exactly how they're communicating with one another, and also like I said, their order of battle. So in a way, I think it's easier intel to exploit, but like any good intel, it's perishable. So really, it needs to be exploited within the next few months. And I think that the Imperial Japanese Army would regularly change some of its coding and whatnot too. So you were gonna have that problem. But yeah, it's ironic because I'm sure MacArthur was frustrated at times that the Navy had better intel than he did for some of the fleet engagements we're going to have. But now that changes in early 1944, and it dramatically impacts, of course, his operations that year.
So Bill, the Japanese expected the Allies, as we're working our way up New Guinea, and I mean, they know that we're coming. They expected us to land at a place called Hansa Bay, um, and because of that, they set up their defenses to repel that invasion that they thought was coming. But because of this intel breakthrough, things kind of shaped up differently. But tell us about what goes on with the Japanese defenses at Hansa Bay, and what leads us to landing where we do land, which is Hollandia and Aitape here in the near future.
Well, Seth, the short answer here, again, we're going to look at Papua New Guinea, bring up the map and make our viewers happy again. But the short answer here is the Japanese concentration forces were down along this area. I think if I got that right, John, of PNG Peninsula, northern part of the island. And of course, you got famous Wewak Harbor, which is right here. You'll remember from the 3rd Patrol of the Wahoo and Mush Morton penetrating that. There's a pretty good concentration. That's a great anchorage. And then the other great anchorage is up here in the area of what we're referring to today as Hollandia and Aitape in here. So the Japanese believed that the invasion would come down here, and they really built up defenses. In fact, I think they had, correct me if I'm wrong here, Seth, something like 2 divisions down there. And because of this intel, MacArthur was able to say, all right, if they're here, we're going to do something different and land where they ain't. He was famous for saying that and then not doing it. But this is one occasion where, in fact, he does it, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. He does. Hansa Bay was initially a target for MacArthur. That's actually where he did plan to land at one point. But to your point, Bill, once he got this intelligence that the Japanese had, 2 divisions plus of people there, he was like, nah, we're not going there. If I know that there's this many people waiting for me there under a general named Adachi, he's like, no, we're not going to go there. We're going to hit them where they ain't, and we're going to land at a place that can serve a similar purpose in Hollandia with the anchorage that it will serve here in the future, and Aitape, and we're going to basically cut these Japanese off. And that's essentially what he does. He wants to bypass Hansa Bay, jump over this area, land in Hollandia and Aitape, and just let these guys wither on the vine. John, this is no different than bypassing Kolombangara in the Solomons, and that, or other places, Truck, for instance, or even Rabaul, that we're just jumping over these people. We're going to let them wither on the vine. And to your point, what you were saying about, the Japanese intel officer that consigns these guys to a horrible fate. These are 50,000 plus people that are now cut off, that are going to wither in the New England, Jesus, in the New Guinea jungles, and either fight or die, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of elements to this. One of the reasons Hansa Bay is so attractive is that the North New Guinea coast is hard to traverse. There's a lot of coral outcroppings, a lot of coral ridges and whatnot that make it very difficult for landings. So the Japanese understand that Hansa Bay is probably the most desirable, feasible area. And of course, not just a matter of landing, but where you can develop a naval base and where you can develop any semblance of depots and logistical bases is really the key to this whole thing. So that's why, and so, you've got to go farther west to Aitape and to Hollandia to really have anything even remotely like that. So yes, MacArthur had totally intended to get after Hansa Bay for these obvious reasons. I also think it's sort of analogous to what's going on almost at the same time in Europe, in that Calais is so heavily defended because it's the most desirable place to land. And Normandy is an alternate on some levels, of course, also heavily defended too, whereas, of course, Hollandia and Aitape are not. But so you have that component to it as well. The other thing that happens is that for this to even get in front of MacArthur and make him aware, there also has to be some interesting dynamics in place as well. So when the intel becomes sort of common knowledge among the staff, even then, there is not unanimity that they need to kind of leapfrog around Hansa Bay and go to Hollandia and whatnot. It's through, uh, there's a lot of people who want to take credit for it because it ends up so well. But
Right.
Lieutenant General George Kenney, who's MacArthur's remarkable air commander, is a player in this, as is Bonner Fellers, who's this interesting sort of shadowy kind of court MacArthur court character. On some levels, he's an intel guy. He's the military secretary for MacArthur, but he's psyops too. So in this case, he's had to kind of push hard to put this in front of MacArthur because MacArthur's G3, his operations officer Steve Chamberlain, who's a pretty competent guy, was not really sold on the concept, and he basically, according to what he will later say, and Fellers especially, he'll basically tell Fellers, stand down. I don't want you telling the general about this. We're going on with the Hansa Bay thing. And Fellers basically disobeys, and it comes to MacArthur's attention, and MacArthur gets really on board with the concept. And so Fellers gets fired from his job that he had, but MacArthur hangs on to him as his military secretary and PSYOPs guy. So there's even, we talk about good actionable intelligence, but also kind of luck and dynamics and weird. I mean, it would have been very possible that this could have never been used, and they would have still gone for Hansa Bay if you wouldn't have this kind of dynamic happening, and these folks are working for MacArthur.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely a case of somebody, like you said, disobeying orders, but looking at the intelligence and realizing that this is important, that I don't care really what you say here. This is likely going to save lives and still get the same mission accomplished in the end. So the targets for the invasions, plural, will be Hollandia and Aitape, as we said just a minute ago. They're situated on the northern coast of New Guinea, and it is the only large scale, one of the only large scale anchorages east of Wewak. It's located on Humboldt Bay. The anchorage that Hollandia will provide was first rate and would prove to be a valuable anchorage, second only really to Majuro and later Ulithi for the fast carriers as they pounded westward uh, throughout the rest of the year. In addition to the plan to invade Hollandia, a plan was also drawn up to simultaneously invade Aitape. It's included in MacArthur's schedules of events. Located roughly 125 miles southeast of Hollandia, and therefore closer to Adachi's forces at Wewak, Aitape was seen as a necessary location to basically block any Japanese attempt to come from Wewak to hit Hollandia. Also, they had an airfield there, Taji, I believe it was called, John, um, that the Allies figured that they could use to also deflect any kind of Japanese air presence that would come through here. Now, you mentioned some dynamics that go into play here, and Bill and I have talked about Nimitz and MacArthur's relationship here and there, but we've never really gone into a whole heck of a lot of detail. But in order to accomplish this mission, Mac is going to need the help of the Navy, and not just the help of the Navy that he has been using as he's been going up through New Guinea, but the Big Blue Fleet, Chester Nimitz's fast carriers in Task Force 58 under Mark Mitcher. He and MacArthur and Nimitz finally get to having a meeting, and Nimitz actually comes down to see Mac, and they hang out for a couple of days, and in the end, they come out with a fairly decent relationship, and they come together with a plan for this operation. Can you tell us a little bit about that shindig that they had?
Yeah, so for almost a year, MacArthur had sort of viewed Nimitz as this adversary, because MacArthur figured, that the Navy was always plotting against him in Washington, D.C. circles and whatnot, and that they would get resources that rightfully belonged to him and all this. And I think MacArthur had a really very narrow view on some levels, and was not quite understanding just how well he and Nimitz could work together. And I think Nimitz, for his part, I've always felt that his forbearance is incredible. His patience level with what is often just complete immaturity on MacArthur's part at times. And so when he gets the invitation from MacArthur to come, to Australia and start to figure out their sort of joint plans for 1944, he leaps at it. It's also very MacArthur-esque too that he has the other guy travel to him rather than MacArthur traveling to
Hmm.
the other guy.
Yep.
But be that as it may, Nimitz doesn't worry about that, and he quite rightly goes to Australia, and they do have a meeting of the minds. Except there's one moment that's really awkward. At a in one kind of meeting or planning session, Nimitz makes the sort of mistake of saying something in the order of, "Well, if we do go to the Philippines, if that makes sense, or something," and MacArthur immediately sees on that, like, "Oh, we must and we will, and it's our mission and it's our," so he's treated to this whole screed, and he's like, "Yeah, okay, I was just sort of talking notionally," So bottom line, Nimitz promises the use of, as you said, Mitcher's fast carriers to support the Hollandia op. So why is this really significant? Well, one of the reasons why Hollandia was going to be a pretty big gamble and why Chamberlain didn't like it is because the Japanese had a lot of land-based air at Hollandia. They had over 100 planes, and that's a pretty potent force that could threaten those ships, of course, not just the fast carriers, but the landing ships and whatnot. But the troops once they're ashore. So Kenny basically has to reassure Nimitz that these guys are not going to be a problem, that he's going to take care of them, so that the carriers will not be in danger. And the way he's going to do this is an incredible bait and switch. I think this is maybe Kenny's finest moment of World War II. He understood that the Japanese believed his P-38s
Hmm.
did not have enough range to escort his bombers to the Hollandia area, and thus the bombers would be quite vulnerable, and thus the Japanese could perhaps control some semblance of the air. What he's really done, he's welcomed about 50 to 60 brand new P-38s in theater that have the range, and then he's refitted others with special fuel and drop tanks, and he's done this all on the sly, and he's kind of had a bait and switch, and that he's forbade his crews to operate west of a certain line in New Guinea to continue to the Japanese think this. So eventually he's going to uncork that fist, well before the invasion, and basically neutralize the Japanese land-based air. It's a devastating strike. Well, this then will allow Mitcher's carriers to operate without fear of land-based air attacks. And so MacArthur needs that air support because it's going to take a while to develop the airfield at Taji and develop, obviously the fields that you're going to want at Hollandia to give you closer range fighter support and whatnot. So, there's really quite a spirit of partnership when they do meet, Nimitz
Hmm.
and MacArthur in Australia. And I really think, and this is just my opinion, if we're looking not just here but the whole war, MacArthur gets a lot more out of that partnership than Nimitz ever does, because,
Oh
and
yeah.
this is the first indicator of it, MacArthur is constantly going to let Nimitz down in terms of what he's giving in return. What he had offered in return
Hmm.
is once he can develop airfields around Hollandia, that he would have his land-based bombers, Kenny's land-based bombers, support the fleet in subsequent operations in 1944. Not MacArthur's fault, but as it turns out, those fields are just not suited to those kind of bombers, and so he will provide no support there. And
Right.
so again, I just think Nimitz's patience with MacArthur is legendary in my mind. But there's a little subplot to this too that I should mention. It's sort of in MacArthur's defense. MacArthur felt that he'd been let down by the Navy during the 1941-42 campaign. Admiral Thomas Hart,
Hmm.
who controls a fleet that's really kind of overmatched on some levels with the Japanese.
Big
But
time.
even then, I think MacArthur felt, and I think with some fairness to this, that perhaps Hart's submarines might have been a bigger player in inflicting damage on the Japanese in 41 and 42. MacArthur had thought, well, they betrayed me, they did this, the Navy's no good, and it was a ridiculous viewpoint. But to his credit, he comes around on that view, and especially once he has a very strong partnership with Halsey. So by 1944, MacArthur, I think, understands very, very well the potency of the naval forces under the command of certainly Halsey, but also Tommy Kincaid, and the possibilities that Nimitz has. And I think he has really sort of revised his view. So he demonstrated maybe some flexibility that other commanders might not have, and I think certainly it's one of the things that helps this whole operation.
Yeah, no doubt. And this is going to be a huge operation, and he's going to need Chester Nimitz and Mark Mitchell's aircraft carriers. Bill, tell us about this thing. This is not this. This is to this point. This is the largest operation that MacArthur has unfolded, shall we say? There's a lot of moving pieces that are going into this thing.
It's huge. I mean, we got over 800 aircraft, both carrier and land based. We've got 217 warships, including Mitchell's Task Force 58 that you mentioned, Seth, 31 LCIs, 51 LSTs, 55 destroyers and other ships, including heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and 8 escort carriers. So first part, Nimitz did promise the participation of the 8 escort carriers that would directly support Aitape, and then once the airfield at Taji had been captured and could be used, then would move on to support Hollandia. But as you said, it turns out that those airfields weren't as useful to us as we think they would have been, Seth.
Right. Yeah, and Mac orders that elements of 2 United States Army divisions would take part in this operation in Hollandia. The veteran 41st Infantry Division and the 24th ID that had once been at Schofield Barracks during the Pearl Harbor attack. For Aitape, elements of the 41st as well as the veteran 32nd Infantry Division would hit the shores there. The 32nd would come later. Combined, the manpower of the 2 landings exceeded 52,000 people. So this is by far Nimitz. This is by far MacArthur's largest operation yet in the Pacific War. These ground forces fell under the command of General Walter Kruger and his 6th Army. John, Walter Kruger is a guy we've just barely spoken about. Who is Walter Kruger? What is he like? What is he doing?
And John, as you talk about that, maybe you could talk about the relationship between the 6th Army, how many numbered armies there were in the Pacific, and I think his 1st Corps, I Corps, as well, and how that order of battle all fell out.
Yeah, sure. So here's what happens in terms of the organizational structure. By 1943, the early part of 1943, MacArthur's SWAPA was starting to have enough ground forces to have beyond a corps level command. So there was going to be an army level command, but in classic sort of MacArthur way, he was deeply concerned that the Australian officers on site, like particularly General Blamey, would have seniority and would lay claim somehow to commanding any kind of army level force that was stood up. So in order to kind of circumvent this, he stands up an army-sized headquarters, but calls it Alamo Force rather than giving it an actual numbered army. It's only going to be much later toward the end of 1943 that'll be known as 6th Army. And then he brings Lieutenant General Walter Kruger to the theater, who would clearly have seniority over Blamey and so on and so forth. So Kruger is only a year younger than MacArthur. And he is going to come to theater in 1943 and command this Alamo Force that becomes 6th Army. So by the time of the Hollandia landings, it is openly known as 6th Army and will be for the rest of the war. But it starts its life confusingly as Alamo Force. Why Alamo? Well, because Kruger and his wife were going to make their post-war home in San Antonio. So as a tribute to him, it becomes known as Alamo Force, and then, of course, 6th Army. Now, Kruger's just this fascinating dude. He was actually born in Germany. He's one of, to my knowledge, only 2 foreign-born generals in the U.S. Army in World War II, the other being Ben Lear, who was born in Canada. I don't know if that really counts, but Kruger was born in Germany. I think that definitely counts. And he's the son of an army officer, a German army officer. So really, in a different kind of universe, he could have served in World War I as a German army officer. Instead, his father died when he was an adolescent, and so his mother moves Kruger and herself to the United States. They immigrate to the United States. Interestingly enough, they came to St. Louis, and it's interesting because that's where I live. Why did they come here? Well, there was a major German American community, still is, in St. Louis, and supposedly Kruger's uncle either owned a brewery or was affiliated with one, worked at one. And that was very, very common for German Americans in St. Louis in the late 19th century. So here's this adolescent, transplanted to a new country, having to learn a new language, a new culture, new schools. He spoke English with hardly an accent, really no accent, the rest of his life. Very proud of that. He had quite a penchant for languages. Obviously, he spoke German, but also French and Spanish. He was conversant with Latin. And so he's making his way in this new country. And then in 1898, War with Spain breaks out. So Walter is military minded. I guess he probably inherits that from his father. And he decides he's going to join the army as a private. So he joins as a 17-year-old private in 1898, and then about a half century later retires as a 4-star general. I mean, that's just amazing, And the other thing that's so incredible about it is to consider the educational level. He's commissioned from the ranks, and by the way, he's commissioned from the ranks when he's serving in the Philippines during the Philippine-American War in the early 20th century. So, unlike a lot of his, senior officer peers, of course, he has no West Point pedigree. But he has no college degree, and he has no high school diploma. I mean, that'll never happen again. And yet, he's in some ways smarter and better educated on some levels than many of them because he's an autodidact. He's, once he's an officer, he's really quite an intellectual on some levels in terms of military strategy and the sort of wonky policy papers that he writes in the 1920s, articles he publishes and whatnot. And so as Walter Kruger moves up through the ranks to become like a lieutenant colonel, a colonel, a senior officer, one of the things that's quite emblematic about him is that he always has a tremendous sympathy and rapport for the average soldier. And the reason is because he was one. So dry socks are really important to him. The way the soldiers are eating, really important to him. In terms of his personality, now he's an excellent husband and father. I mean, he has a very loving wife, Grace. He's a terrific husband. He has 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter. And he's a very warm-hearted father. But in his professional life, he's very different than he is at home. He's brusque. He's no nonsense. He's often rude. He just doesn't get it in terms of how to kind of schmooze with people, or to how to, maybe a better way to say it is how to make people feel comfortable and wanted and needed and valued. That's not his strength. His strength is his honesty. His strength is his caring for soldiers, his intellectual aptitude, his military aptitude. But often he's thought of as methodical and cautious. And there's a great deal of truth to that. But he's also sensible. So where does sensible give way to over caution, or what, and vice versa? That's what's hard to decide, right? So Kruger is somebody who's been chosen personally by MacArthur for this, I think, in part because of the seniority, because of his reliability, the respect he has throughout the army, but also he doesn't care about the limelight at all. Kruger's very happy to operate under the radar in terms of publicity, and then that's MacArthur's guy.
Good thing.
Yeah.
So underneath Kruger is another guy that we have talked about before, who is one of my favorite Army commanders in the Pacific. Well, one of my favorite Army commanders, period. And that's Robert Eichelberger. Eichelberger had been sidelined after Bunagona, which he kind of pulled that. Well, he didn't kind of. He pulled that operation out of the mud and made it succeed. Yet he is sidelined. He's sidelined after that. Mac shanghais him from getting a command in Europe and really pisses Eichelberger off. But, to Mac's credit, he's hanging on to Eichelberger because he knows he's going to need him in the future. Tell us a little bit about Bob Eichelberger. He was a fantastic commander, fantastic leader too.
He's an incredible commander. In my opinion, he's probably the best U.S. ground commander that the average American has never heard of. And I don't just mean in World War II. I mean, maybe in all of U.S. Military history. He's just outstanding on many levels. So it's interesting because I think in some ways he's really similar to Kruger in that he's honest. He's a really good person on some levels. His soulmate is his wife, Emma.
Mm-hmm.
Eichelberger has a kind of a fundamental decency about him, which I think Kruger does too. But they're also temperamentally quite different, and their backgrounds are different. So Eichelberger came from a really kind of well off background in Ohio. He's the son of a Civil War veteran on the U.S. side in Ohio, and so Eichelberger's father was a successful lawyer and a kind of gentleman farmer who owned a lot of land and a beautiful house. And Eichelberger grows up under these wonderful circumstances of just an ideal kind of childhood. He's the youngest of five children, but the sort of conflict in his life comes from the fact that his father, like a lot of sort of successful parents who have been through war, and now have this sort of next generation under them who have been grown up, in sort of comfortable circumstances. Eichelberger's father had become convinced that his kids were soft and they never make it in the world, and that he had to really kind of test them and constantly bring adversity to them. So he runs the family like a reality show of pitting the kids in competition with one another. And Eichelberger has three older brothers and one older sister, and he's the youngest. It's tough for him to compete at that level, especially with his older brothers. So he's not taken seriously. He's beloved because he has this sort of endearing personality from the beginning. He has a voracious kind of reading and interest in the Civil War. He loved to sit there when Eichelberger's father would have his fellow veterans over and they'd discuss the war. And also his mother too. By the way, his mother had Mississippi roots and had been in Vicksburg during the siege, and so he had sort of both sides in the Civil War, similar to his boss MacArthur. So Eichelberger is a kind of child of history in some respects and beloved, but not taken very seriously. Like little Bobby, the baby, pat him on the head, and he's not going to amount to much. So soldiering became his thing. He always had this chip on his shoulder to achieve something, to achieve great distinction. And he finds his way at West Point, that he could be a very fine soldier. So in terms of his background, during World War One, he had not gone to the Western Front. He had actually gone to Russia with the Polar Bear expedition to snuff out the Bolshevik regime. And so he sees combat there. He's an intel guy there. He's the key staff officer and aide for General Graves, the commander of the American troops there. So Eichelberger also, interestingly, had served embedded with a Japanese unit and had studied them. So really, he's quite similar to Kruger in this sort of military intellectual side that he has. So he's been studying the Japanese for years. And he's, in terms of his operational outlook, he's aggressive. He loves maneuver warfare. He is very, very in tune with leading from the front, the inspirational type commander. Very in tune with the average soldier as well on a lot of levels. Really quite similar to his West Point classmate, George Patton. And I found that they kept in touch during the war. They wrote back and forth, greatly admired each other. But Eichelberger lacks Patton's ruthlessness,
Panache.
all the sort of ugly side of Patton, the racism and the the sort of political incorrectness or whatever these headaches he causes Eisenhower. No, Eichelberger gives you all the greatness at the front without all that drama. So what's the problem with MacArthur? Well, Eichelberger is garrulous, and he has friends everywhere, and he gets on well with war correspondents. So he's a challenge in terms of publicity. And so what happens is that, Seth, you mentioned Buna. Well, Eichelberger, is leading from the front for a month, loses 30 pounds in 30 days. I mean, he salvages that mess into the first American ground victory in World War II. And after he gets permission from MacArthur to speak to the correspondents, and he does so well, MacArthur's like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done this. And then he backbenches and then threatens to bust him to colonel and send him home. And I always thought, well, yeah, go ahead and do that, because you're going to see how quickly Eisenhower is going to scoop him up for the Normandy invasion. Because Eisenhower, I found in my research, Eisenhower did want him for probably a corps level command, possibly even army level. So, MacArthur realizes, I can't do that. So let me just hang on to this guy, and we'll have him train people in Australia for almost a year. And then now, once he needs him, he's front and center as I Corps commander in Hollandia, and that's going to be control those two divisions that go ashore.
Yeah,
Remind me, is this the
and
famous go to Boonagona and don't come back alive?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Take
Conversation?
Boona Bob and don't come back
mhm.
alive. Yeah,
Yeah,
imagine if your boss told you that. You know, go on this patrol, Bill, or don't come back alive. You know, I mean, it's unreal. And so I mean, yeah, when Eichelberger goes into Boona, he's been told by MacArthur that time is of the essence, that he's got to make this happen so quickly, and he eventually wins the victory. And then once he's out of there, he's amazed to hear MacArthur tell the press time wasn't really important; it was just a matter of wearing them down and all this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, as Seth mentioned earlier, Eichelberger would really become quite resentful of MacArthur. I think understandably so, but he really suppresses that during the war because he knows he's got to get along and that's his boss, and
That's
they
his
actually work
boss.
together.
yeah, and we got to move on. But I mean, as was Eisenhower, Nimitz, and pretty much anybody who dealt with him. So I had to say
Right.
that.
Exactly.
So the forces under Eichelberger would land at Hollandia in two locations. Elements of the 24th Infantry would land at Tanamera Bay, and the 41st would land at Humboldt Bay and link up in the area before Lake Sentani, thus providing an encircled and contiguous beachhead, at least somewhat. The complex plans, and they were complex, and simultaneous landings, three actually, if you add Aitape, would stretch the abilities and resources of MacArthur's forces. Bill, deception played a role in this operation as well. Um, Tell us a little bit about that. And to John's point, when Kenny unleashes these 38s, they go down there and they just absolutely lay waste to the Japanese air forces. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, Seth. What was happening here was, General Kennedy used a really great bait and switch tactic on kind of misleading the enemy as it pertained to what the future objectives would be. So his P-24s, P-38s, and other strike aircraft hit Japanese airfields, decimating anything that might have gotten airborne during the upcoming landings. Over 340 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, with the majority of those being destroyed on the ground, while paltry 4 Allied aircraft were lost. The disparity in losses was one of the most through one side of the war, and certainly in the Southwest Pacific area. But the deception gets to the point where General Kennedy essentially said, guys, I don't want you to fly west of this line. And because of that, I think it helped to convince the Japanese of what they already believed that the landing beach would be. And guys, I mean, does this really work as well as we think it did?
Oh, it works beautifully.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Go
it
ahead, John.
absolutely negates the Japanese air. It allows Mitcher's carriers to operate there for the timetable they're going to be operating. They are under no duress from any land-based air. The landings go off, more or less as planned. I mean, it really at the Hollandia landings, the problem isn't necessarily the Japanese opposition; it's the terrain. The
Yeah,
terrain, the beaches are awful, especially on the Tanamera
yeah.
side. And so
That,
that's really the issue. Now, of course, subsequent once the beachhead is there, it's a target for any stray Japanese aircraft that get through. Now, that's another matter. But in terms of molesting the fleet or whatever, no. Another deception point is bombardment. So you know how famously during the run up to the Normandy invasion, we sent 2 bombing missions at Calais for every one in Normandy and all that. Well, this is really
mhm.
similar because we're sending bombing raids to Hansa Bay, to that area there too, to the near where the 2 Japanese divisions are, but also the bombardment. Naval bombardment too. You're going to have PT boats that are going to zip along the coast at night, as if preparing for some sort of special ops, or landing Alamo scouts who are like special recon people. So there's all this kind of bait and switch that really does completely fool General Adachi and the Japanese, that they really have no idea the Hollandia operations are happening. And also, too, when the fleet does move, once the troops are aboard, and it's moving west, there's going to be the fleet is going to be zigzagging even then to try and keep the Japanese guessing as to where they're actually going to disgorge those troops.
Once they do disgorge the troops, John, to your point, it's there is hardly any Japanese resistance on all the beaches. Hansa Bay, not Hansa, Humboldt Bay, Tanamera Bay, and Aitape. I mean, these guys pretty much walk ashore, but it's once they get ashore that the terrain just eats them alive, because as good as the intel had been to prepare the MacArthur's forces for this by, cutting off the people at Hansa Bay and going to Hollandia and Aitape and all this, the aerial reconnaissance, the terrain intelligence was completely non-existent, shall we say. The terrain a mere 30 yards behind the beach in some locations wasn't anything like a road. They aerial reconnaissance had said that there was a road that would connect the two landing areas, and in fact it was a swamp. It wasn't a road at all. There were no roads. It was nothing but a friggin' swamp. And as we've talked about swamps in New Guinea before, these are some nasty swamps. I mean, this isn't anything you can really trudge through with any kind of rapidity. This is some serious stuff, and it just brings what was a absolutely perfect landing to a snail's pace, because they can't get the hell off the beach. And when the beach is only 30 yards deep ish, all these supplies that are just pouring ashore, they got nowhere to go. So they just wind up stacking them, and they on the beach, and they become these mountains of supplies, which, as you said just a second ago, do eventually become very, very ripe targets for Japanese aerial opposition. Now, what is true that we eliminated a tremendous number of Japanese airplanes in the area. We didn't kill all of them. And as a matter of fact, this stockpiling of American supplies on the beach comes back to bite us in the butt here when a Japanese air raid does indeed hit the area. And when it hits the area, it doesn't blow up just a couple of crates of stuff. It tears up everything in this one area for a day or two. There's a fire going on there. This is some serious stuff, and this causes a major supply issue with the people that are ashore and pushing inland. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, even before that, once the troops have gotten ashore, you're talking about very long, strung out columns of soldiers walking on whatever trails they can find or cutting trails. And through those swamps, we've got a guy who drowns on the first day in a swamp. We've got another situation where a guy's getting bogged down in a swamp, and has to soldier. He holds his rifle out or with his for his sergeant to try and help him out, and the weapon discharges and kills the sergeant. You basically landed in a Japanese rear area, and so whoever's there has sort of taken to the jungle or has been shot and destroyed or captured here and there. And so now your orders are to unload reinforcements and supplies, but there's hardly any room. Like you said, Seth. So it's a 30-yard beach that gives way to thick jungle or to swamp.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you unload it? What do you do? How do you get vehicles moving? And so there's a tendency for this to be bottlenecking. Now, to be sure, the 41st and the 24th, their vanguards are moving pretty well along the sort of narrow, muddy trails that are, they'll eventually link up without too much of a problem from Japanese resistance. But back at the beach, here's our issue. I mean, because there's all that stuff stacking up, all the logistical sinews, and a lone Japanese aircraft comes through, I think a couple of nights after the invasion, gets lucky by dropping a bomb in an ammo dump, which creates sympathetic detonations, a chain reaction. Of course, you can imagine how much combustible material there is. There's trucks that burn and whose tires burn straight down to the hubcaps. There's metal that's actually melted and burned because the fire becomes so intense. You can imagine all the ammo's cooking off. It's like a 4th of July thing. And so here are, we talk about the infantry a lot, the so-called trigger pullers. Well, I'll tell you what, in this case, it's the quartermasters and ordnance people. Who are doing a lot of the most courageous work here to try and pull ammo crates away, to try and build fire breaks as all this is going on. You have specially fitted LCIs that are coming in as like firefighters to try and hose down this. The flames, by the accounts of those who were there, rise at least 500 feet in the air in some places. You can imagine the smoke. And so, you have, I think, 24 men killed, about over 100 some odd wounded, and some who are burned. It's about 2 days or so before this is brought under any semblance of control. And it just kind of makes me wonder, my gosh, what could have happened if the Japanese really had larger fleets of planes that could be coming in regularly? We were really fortunate that they didn't. This amounted really to more of a headache than a hole in the head in terms of the logistics that Eichelberger is going to have to deal with once these two divisions are fully ashore. But he will then redirect elements of the 24th Division to come ashore at Humboldt, because that was really a better area to land than Tanamera, as things turned out. The other thing I should mention too, Horace Fuller, the commander of the 41st Division, had wanted to land on every available inch of beach, and initially the naval amphibious commanders had said, no, we don't think our craft can get in on this one segment of the beach here. But Fuller had kind of gone to the brink on this and said, no, I need that. And I think in retrospect, it was good that he did, because you can imagine how the funneling would have been even worse on a kind of half of Humboldt Beach or whatever. As it was really bad, though.
Yeah. I mean, supplies had to be hand carried to the forward units. And by hand carried, I mean literally hand carried. I mean, they were humped from the beach up forward to the forward elements that were connecting back there in the jungle by Lake Santani. I mean, this was a serious supply issue, kind of almost reminiscent of Guadalcanal, frankly, in that, the guys that really needed the supplies the most couldn't get them because of multiple issues, not the least of which was the fire you talked about, the massive conflagration on the beach, but also just the fact that the intel that had played such a valuable part in getting these people there was so wrong on the terrain side of everything, that these guys were literally strung out with not much of anything. They were put on half rations for a while. So I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the infantry, as always, is usually the guys that suffer the worst, and that's exactly what happens here. And going back to what we were saying before, the Japanese defensive measures around there were virtually non-existent, but they do run into some defenses. They do run into some opposition as they're pushing further inland. Nothing that's really going to stymie the invasion. However, that being said, in one instance, I believe it's the 21st Infantry Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Clifford. These guys run into a small band of Japanese that, had this band of Japanese been larger, it could have delayed them for days or weeks even, because of the terrain. But again, we're getting back to the terrain issue. These guys couldn't get around these people because of the swampy terrain, because of the lakes and everything else, and it was just a bottleneck in that area back there, that eventually the infantry does move forward. They have to call in a lot of heavy artillery to wipe the Japanese out or cut them off, and the situation does wrap itself up eventually. But the supply issue for both of these operate, really technically all three. Aitape was a little bit better, but Hollandia and Humboldt Bay and Tanamera Bay, that was just a supply issue, was more of an issue for the Americans than were the Japanese, which is probably the first time that you can actually say that. At Guadalcanal it was both, but here it's mainly the supplies. John, Aitape. Aitape is an issue that that was a simultaneous landing. It happens at the exact same, or within a couple of hours of the Hollandia operations. This is a very similar operation in that it too meets very, very little resistance on the beaches, and these guys push in rather quickly here as well, don't they?
They do, yeah. The 163rd Infantry, which is one of the three regiments of the 41st Division, is sent in there as a regimental combat team, which means that it has these kind of attachments to it, in addition to the infantry. So that's artillery and engineers and so on and so forth. They're going to have total surprise. They're going to take and develop the Taji airfield, which is why we're there, basically as a fighter field for close air support, but also, and sort of refer back to the map that Bill was showing earlier. I mean, that's the whole eastern flank of the landings. We've sandwiched, yeah, exactly. Thank you, Bill. So we basically sandwiched Adachi's people in between our enclave there at Aitape and the airfield, and then of course farther to the east, the sort of main body of the Australians and any other American forces that are coming from that direction. So that's a very successful landing, and it's going to be followed on by elements of the 32nd Infantry Division, which, of course, had won the victory at Buna and had been so wrung out, so badly mauled that it take the better part of about a year or so to reconstitute what was an excellent division, the Red Arrow Division, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan National Guard. So what happens in the wake of this whole Aitape landing that's so successful? That's our eastern flank of the Hollandia landings, and obviously Adachi knows this, and he knows now he's kind of outflanked, and he's going to react to that. So he decides he's going to try and move his people westward, which is a lot easier said than done, and try and snuff out that American airfield and beachhead there. And that becomes what's known as the Driniamore River battle and all this kind of stuff too. So what I'd say is the sort of larger takeaway from that is even the most successful flanking maneuvers or movements in land warfare can be really problematic and can lead to a pretty potent enemy response. The Germans find this out in a tank battle called Arras in France in 1940.
Mm-hmm.
There's all sorts of instances of this on the Russian front. We see it in Normandy, by the way, too. The 2nd Armored Division fights a hellacious battle on July 28th and 29th after the breakthrough and all this. So this is the Pacific War example of that. The New Guinea's large enough and the Japanese presence there large enough that they can have a reaction even though they're really in trouble logistically.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of Aitape originally is to support those landings to the west, but as things develop, it becomes that sort of eastern bulwark of the whole American presence there in that part of the island.
Right, and that whole decision to take that area proves to be very fortuitous because the intelligence, American or Allied intelligence rather, is telling us that Adachi does have a lot of dudes over there in the Wewak area, and he is coming. So the whole, just to put it in perspective, the whole Hollandia Aitape, the initial part of the operation, wraps up by April the 26th. So I mean, this is just a few days. I mean, it's wham bam in out, and we're there and we're hunkered down, and we've established our defensive perimeters that are going to theoretically hold back any kind of Japanese counter thrust. Now, because of the intel that we're receiving that Adachi is going to be coming down here with his people, the 32nd Infantry that comes in afterwards that you just talked about, the veterans of Bunagona, they set up a defensive perimeter along several of the rivers that led towards Wewak. So we know these guys are coming, and there's a whole intricate back and forth with Kruger and some of the commanders in the area about where to put the defensive lines and aggressive patrolling and all this other stuff that goes on back and forth here, and it's kind of a cluster there for a while. But again, this episode particular, we've talked a lot about intel and how it's good and how it's bad, and this is another perfect example of this. Is that while I said we have intel that the Japanese are coming, and then Adachi is bringing the better part of 20,000 guys down to this area, John, several of the people, and by people I mean commanding officers in the area that really should know this information, don't. And that some of the commanding officers in the area, when the Japanese eventually do strike, and they do, the guys that need to know that these people are coming have no friggin' clue that they're coming, and they're caught completely off guard.
Yeah, it's almost inexcusable, to be honest with you. What I compare it to is the Allies are like weather forecasters who know that a big storm is coming. But in terms of like actual on the ground intel of where you'd have to worry about that storm and your timetable and all that for the people who really need it, that info does not get down there. And that's on Willoughby, Brigadier General Charles Willoughby, who's MacArthur's intel guy. Who really, when you think about all the advantages he's got at this point in the war, you would really, I think, fairly expect more from him. He will make the statement that never have commanders been so better prepared intel wise for a battle. That would have been absolute news to the soldiers who are right there at the Driniamore River, who all of a sudden have this massive Japanese attack in their faces. I think it's July 10th, 11th, 1944. That ends up as this sort of running battle that goes on for the next 6 weeks or so. You also have the 112th Cavalry involved too, and and in the better part of the 32nd Division, you're going to see a regiment from the 31st Division come into play, the 124th. In addition to the 163rd, and it's just really it's incredibly messy because the Japanese are in rotten shape. just moving to the line of battle has been an enormous challenge for them. But there's plenty of fight left in these guys too, almost out of desperation. The other thing that I think is important in this whole mix is, and this has to do with the landings. It's very much a pattern in the Pacific War, that we don't really have a good understanding of terrain where we're landing. We don't always know the Japanese presence there. In this case, we did, because we don't have a lot of on the ground intel. Like the French resistance is giving a lot of really good intel about German dispositions in Normandy, say. We don't, coast watchers notwithstanding, we don't always have that in the Pacific War. The Alamo Scouts help, but even then, you mentioned Los Negros earlier as a maybe an intel failure, and even then, that could have gone sideways. So, in this case, the reason I do take Willoughby to task is because everybody knows the Japanese are coming, and that being the case, I think it's really incumbent upon the higher headquarters to get to the people who really need it, that kind of real-time info to say, okay, this is when you can and should expect the attack, and probably this is where they're going to go, we think.
Bill, we talked about, when we can, we talk about Japanese commanders, and this guy Adachi is one of those unique Japanese army commanders. In the past, whenever the Japanese launch any kind of counteroffensive or offensive, they ultimately say, we're going to wipe out the beachhead. We're going to kill every American in sight. We're going to do this, and the battle's going to be over, and we're going to win, and everything's going to be glorious, and hallelujah. Adachi is not like that. He's a realist. Like, this guy knows what's going on or what's not going to go on, as the case may be. Tell us a little bit about his plans, what he wants to do. And I mean, he's a realist, as I said. He knows he's not going to wipe out this complete American presence here, but he also knows what he can do potentially. Tell us about him. What are his plans here?
Yeah, the old story to worry about the things you can actually affect, and he was a realist. But he did decide one of the things he could affect was to die in battle, and that would be a better fate for his men than starvation and certain death and withering on the vine. So unlike other Japanese commanders, Adachi was, no fool, and did not think for 1 minute his force would dislodge the American presence in and around Hollandia. He knew the position was strong, and he was also somewhat aware that MacArthur planned to move on from the region. So his idea was that by attacking, he might be able to divert Allied forces to that region, thereby weakening the Allied offensive that was going on elsewhere. Again, control what you have control of. He was very shrewd. So his army moved painfully slow through the jungle, averaging just 2 to 5 miles a day at best. Disease, malnutrition, and Allied air raids further weakened his forces, but he was determined to make this assault. And of course, Allied intel was aware that Adachi was moving his forces towards Aitape, and in response built up American defenses in the area, adding several new units to the territory. However, despite the intel advice, Mac's intel officer, the previously mentioned Charles Willoughby, believed that the Japanese were incapable of such an attack in this terrain due to the logistical status, the challenges, and other factors that the Americans were dealing with themselves. So local American intel revealed that an attack was imminent, and troops were placed on alert for weeks. When that attack did not occur, Seth, in that time period, the Americans were taken off alert. As I've said in previous episodes, being on alert actually lowers your readiness long term, and you eventually have to come off alert. And unfortunately, they did that at the worst possible moment, Seth.
Absolutely. On the night of July 10th and 11th, like John was saying, some 10,000, that's 10,000 Japanese attacked en masse across the Jurniuma River. 3 Japanese regiments assaulted American lines in disorganized fashion, as was typically the case of units moving through the jungle. We've talked about this on Guadalcanal. Hayataki's people, just got lost. Kawaguchi's people essentially got lost in the jungle. This is no different here. Units are strung out. Orders to commence the attack are given at different times because they can't get a hold of people. Communication on the Japanese side is virtually non-existent. But regardless of this, three Japanese regiments do assault American lines between 2330 and 0500. So that'll tell you how long this attack lasts, at least the initial attack. Two rifle companies, E and G Company of the 128th Infantry Regiment, took the brunt of the Japanese assault, supported by heavy artillery and machine guns seemingly everywhere. The GIs inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese. Adachi's lead elements were cut down in some units by as much as 90%. John, this is kind of a, second verse, same as the first, or in this case, 10th verse, same as the first, that when Japanese units are assaulting American dug-in positions, they just take a pounding, an absolute pounding, be it from the Army or the Marines, it does not matter. They just take a beating of biblical proportions. However, because of the fact that the Japanese are sending so many people at this one small area, they eventually do break through, and they cause some havoc here, don't they?
No, they absolutely do. They rupture the line, and it leads to a long, confused, running fight that goes on not just that day, for the subsequent days too. Back and forth, the capture and recapture of positions and whatnot. The casualties inflicted on these guys is staggering. There's probably at least 2,000 casualties the first night alone. What it looks like to the Americans, there were so many Japanese bodies in that main area they were attacking that many Americans who were looking at it were wondering, what is that down there? Are those logs, jamming up the river? Because some parts of the river were dry, some parts were wet. It's really kind of horrifying because I think Guadalcanal is a perfect comparison in terms of the misery for the average Japanese soldier of trying to move forward to even attack at all, to have any supplies at all. Most of these guys have lost a lot of weight by the time they attack. Part of their desperation is fueled by the hope of capturing American supplies, American food,
Right.
similar to Guadalcanal, in many instances. So it leads to a kind of for about roughly about a 2-week period of just this attack and counterattack pattern where there's all of these Japanese who just keep kind of popping up as they enter the area, forcing breakthroughs here and there, getting killed mostly. I mean, whatever it is. And then, of course, the latter stage of the Drinium War is this sort of, let's do our aggressive patrolling and chase these guys down and kill them. And that in some ways is even more nightmarish for the Americans, because then you're talking about long, columns and on jungle trails and not knowing where they are and where they're not, ambushes and of course the heat and the lack of food and the tough of supplying and all this kind of stuff that goes on. Adachi, Bill put it right, he's absolutely a realist. He basically has two choices after Hollandia happens. We can sit here, wither on the vine and die, or we can find a way to attack and affect the situation somehow, because he's very smart in that he knows MacArthur's great hope is to move on to the Philippines. And if he can intrude with that timetable, that's good for the Japanese cause. So from Kruger's standpoint, now once this happened, he's really juggling a lot of balls. Because he's got this mess at the Drinium War going on. He's got to worry about defending the Aitape perimeter and the airfield there. A lot of good artillery assets there, by the way, they're in place that really do help. He's got to worry about developing the Hollandia base, which is really Eichelberger's preoccupation, from late April onward, developing into a base out of nothing almost, and then under MacArthur's pressure, continuing to move on west, because also too we didn't mention this, but on the whole western edge of this western flank of this whole thing, there's the fight of the 6th Division at Lone Tree Hill, and the 158th Infantry, the Bushmasters, at Lone Tree Hill. So it's a very complex campaign in that sense.
Yes,
it couldn't be less glamorous. It's in terms of the fighting, it's all Army. And another thing I want to mention too is in terms of the engineering development, it's Army engineers and aviation engineers that are doing it. The Seabees are more famous, and of course, rightfully so, I think. But the Army engineers and the aviation engineers are doing much the same job. And so that's your challenge if you're one of these guys trying to create something out of this mess of a wilderness here. even as the combat soldiers are dealing with Adachi and all of this. From the Japanese standpoint, of course, it's way worse. These guys, of course, we talked about getting killed in the battle there, but more commonly, really, for the Japanese by this point, by mid to late 1944, you're probably wandering around in what they call the Green Desert, the jungled wilderness, slowly starving, slowly dying from some tropical disease, probably succumbing to it, and then getting consumed by animals, by insects. I mean, it's horrifying. Cannibalism. One example I'd give you, and this is a guy who happened to survive. His unit, when it goes into New Guinea, had 2,000 guys in it. Only 67 ever got out. And he's one of the few survivors who could tell us what it was like. And he basically, it's a case of delirium, of just wandering around and just constantly on the lookout for protein. So, like, you catch a lizard, you eat it even while it's alive. I mean, that's the kind of thing, the level of starvation going on. So this is, of course, MacArthur's concept, though, to outflank and starve these guys logistically, and it's quite successful in the long run.
Yeah,
By the way,
it's
John,
the story of the Jap.
my uncle was
Go ahead,
Army
Bill.
engineer in Guadalcanal in the Philippines. So in my family, Army engineers were more famous than Seabees. But go ahead.
In your family, I
Yeah.
wish they were all like that. Yeah, good point.
Well, and of course, here at Camp Shelby is run by engineers, so there's engineers everywhere out here. But the wandering and starving in the New Guinea jungle, and just the jungles in the South Pacific period, is the Japanese MO. It's what happens to them on damn near every island that has any kind of jungle territory, especially New Guinea. But I mean, you're talking about Bunagona. The similar thing happens. Guadalcanal, similar thing happens. Bougainville, similar thing happens. So I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. And you mentioned, the Japanese that are coming down to attack, Adachi's people that are coming down to attack, the 32nd and elements of the 112th and everything else around the Journeyuma. They were suffering moving through the jungle. If there was any American unit that knew about suffering moving through New Guinea's jungles, it would most certainly be the 32nd Infantry Division. But to get back to just a little bit, just to get back a little bit about that, an American counterattack, you mentioned artillery. An American counterattack restores the line somewhat on July 13th, 14th. It closes the gap. And by the way, that gap in the American lines was some 2,000 yards wide. 3 field artillery battalions of 105s support this counterattack. So, I mean, there is a lot of artillery fire that the Americans can pour in here. And that's, frankly, in my opinion, from looking at this, that is the tipping point. I mean, the infantry is great, but that heavy artillery fire support, which the Japanese essentially did not have at all, is really what tips the scales here, because this is a touch and go battle. And it's something that I guarantee most people watching this have never heard of this before, unless they read your book. They never knew about this. And this is a nasty, nasty fight that is one of those instances in the Pacific where, it was touch and go for a while. And there's not to say that the Japanese were going to succeed in pushing us out of there. It wasn't going to happen. But that whole back and forth fight that goes on until the end of July is one of these instances, until you get really to parts of the Philippines that you really don't hear about too much. Normally it's a counterattack and a swift defeat or what have you, but this is a back and forth event that goes on and on and on and on. By the beginning of August, the Japanese offensive had essentially been killed off and petered out. What remained of Adachi's forces began a torturous withdrawal, like you were saying, John, back through the jungle to the Wewak area. During this period of fighting, and I don't think we have the time to get into all the citations for these guys, but there were 4 United States Army soldiers who were awarded the Medal of Honor, all posthumously. Bill, who were these 4 guys? We can't, unfortunately, get into too much detail on them, but who were these 4 guys?
We can't. Interestingly, there was 2 junior enlisted and 2 officers. Donald Lobach of the 32nd ID was only 19 years old. Gerald Endel was 28 years old, from Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. George Boyce was a 2nd lieutenant. He was 29 in the 112th Cavalry. And Dale Christensen was also the 112th Cavalry. So, these guys, he was a second lieutenant as well, all awarded posthumously. And if you read their citations, they're not going to surprise you. These guys were heroes, all of them. And, as many medals of honor in this battle as Tarawa, interestingly, and that one only lasting 75 hours or so. But in this one, a lot longer. Yeah. Go ahead, Seth.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and to your point, and what we were talking about earlier, John, is that this fighting around the Jenny Humor, while all the fighting that had occurred at Aitape and Humboldt Bay and Tanamera Bay and the areas around there had been relatively light in American casualties, this fight here, and Japanese casualty too, by that measure, this fight here along the Jenny Humor is significantly more costly in human lives. 440 Americans were killed, and a further 2,550 were wounded. Japanese casualties for this battle that lasts roughly, 3.5, 4 weeks, are estimated to be between 8 and 10,000 men. A lot of these include starvation and disease deaths as well. There are no concrete figures for the Japanese dead, and probably never will be, frankly, because of those bodies that are still laying in the New Guinea jungle, or what's left of them. The 4-week-long fighting spurt was actually the heaviest and costliest fight undertaken by the United States Army in the Pacific since Bunagona. This is just this one river fight that goes back and forth and back and forth. As American forces moved further towards the Philippines, many of the units involved were rotated out and were replaced with Australian units. We like to bring up our Aussie friends whenever we can, and this is certainly one of those instances in which a lot of these American infantry and cavalry units that we just mentioned are replaced by Australians who continue this long, bloody slog all the way to the end of the damn war. They're going to fight these Japanese all the way until 1945 in this area.
Yep. Yeah, and it's the classic sort of bittersweet thing for the Australians. It's it's sweet in the sense that it's victory. It's they have the initiative. They're going to be constantly on the prowl after the Japanese. It's bitter in the sense of the losses they're taking. So 1942 and 43, Australia is really taking the lead in the ground fighting for the Allies. By 1944 and 45, obviously now they're starting to be put into these backwater areas to whether it's Bougainville or whether this portion of New Guinea or whatever it's going to be, to tie down the Japanese and make sure they're not going to make any more trouble, while the Americans are doing much of the heavy lifting as we go farther north. So Australia, I think, loses some influence on the Allied side as a result of that. But I think that the sweet part of it too is that you're not involved in as costly a battles as had once happened. Right. But I think that partnership is really a lot of times overlooked in our understanding of the Pacific War, the U.S.-Australian partnership, which is so vital. And I think among the Western powers, there is no country that mobilizes a larger percentage of its population in the uniform than does Australia, in addition to serving as obviously a key base, and everything else they're doing throughout the whole war is just, it's just incredible.
Yeah, they were definitely a vital ally. Bill, let's wrap this sucker up. The landings at Hollandia and Aitape contributed heavily towards the goal of silencing the Japanese in the New Guinea area. Wrap this thing up, put a bow on this operation for us. It even though it starts off kind of quiet and ends rather vicious, it is a very, very vital campaign, though, isn't it?
Yeah, if I were to put a bumper sticker on this one, Seth, it would be a heartbreaking statement that half the number of fatalities occurred here, American fatalities occurred here than occurred at Tarawa. Everybody's heard of Tarawa. Nobody's heard of Hollandia and Aitape. And I know that's maybe an exaggeration, but it's not much of one. And it should be front and center in everybody's consciousness of the tragic, great tragic battles in the Pacific War. And some people, my Army friends, would say, yeah, it's the reason nobody's heard of it is because there weren't any Marines here. That's only a exaggeration, right? Marine squads have a PAO per squad. I mean, I'm teasing, but it is a very important point, and I think one that John undoubtedly wants to make is that the
Absolutely.
Army battles throughout the Pacific, and I think part of this is backlash against MacArthur, have much lower, whatever it is, ascendancy, visibility than most of the Marine battles in the Pacific. And that's too bad.
No question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing this does, which is so meaningful long term, is it accelerates MacArthur's timetable to the Philippines, which of course is going to be the nexus of the American War from now to the end. And without Hollandia and Aitape and all that, I'm not sure that you're going to have the Philippines. I mean, who knows? It's all one of those imponderables, but there's no question that it accelerates it and makes it possible as MacArthur would have envisioned, what happens later in 1944.
Yeah, the whole goal of capturing this area, obviously was to cut off the Japanese at Wewak, which it does, and then two was to get this Hollandia anchorage and develop it into a large base for further supplying operations that goes west, and that's exactly what happens here. They turn this thing into naval base Hollandia, and it does to what you were saying earlier, John, through the engineers, Navy Seabees, all these guys convert this area into this huge supply and staging area that does, have a direct result on the Philippine operation that's going to come just a few months later. So Hollandia is one of those areas that, like what Bill was saying, last time we had you on, John, we were talking about the Marshall Islands, and we talked about Majuro and places like Niniwetak and Kwajalein, and things that helped springboard us to the Marianas. This is no different when it helps springboard us to the Philippines, because this is a staging area, this is a supply area that directly influences the landings that are going to happen in October of 1944. Guys, is there anything else we want to say before we wrap this up? And John, I know you got a role, you got things you got to do, and we appreciate you being here with us again.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Love talking it over with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's always good to have you here, and we'll definitely have you on again as we move forward through some of these more United States Army battles as we get through the Pacific. Bill, is there anything you want to wrap up before I do the canned close?
I think we said it all. And thanks again, John.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it.
Yep. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. If you want to see the video version of this, if you're already not watching it, please subscribe to our YouTube channel called the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com with any questions or comments. We will get back to you as soon as we can. Once again, my name is Seth Perrin, and I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. John, thank you again for being with us. Bill?
And I'm Bill Tody. See you again next week.